All right. So the next section, we're going to talk about just kind of an overview of some of the legacies of colonialism. Again, not a definitive list. There's a lot of legacies, but we're going to kind of capture and talk about some of the bigger ones. Because although, I mean, there is still some colonialism happening today. America and France, Britain still have colonies. China and Israel and other countries are still pushing settler colonialism in certain fashion. So that it's definitely not something that's completely gone. But for the most part, at least like that, as part of the three waves of colonialism, historical European colonialism, for the most part, is over. Majority of their colonies, the vast majority throughout the world, have gained independence. But as we a lot of the systems and infrastructures and culture and racism and things like that came with colonialism has never really been dealt with, or oftentimes not even acknowledged, and certainly not dismantled. And a lot of this is because, I mean, if you look at like in Americas, where there Canada, U.S., all the Latin American countries, it wasn't the indigenous people that gained independence. It was basically the colonial elites, the colonial white European elites, that were the ones that fought these wars for independence. And when they gained their wars, they maintained many of the colonial systems, such as like slavery. Slavery, was not abolished. The majority of these revolutions was maintained and continued because it was so profitable on the colonial level. Capitalism, patriarchy, institutional patriarchy, all these systems were in white supremacy were maintained. In some cases they're dismantled. In other cases they're just transformed. Like America, in the United States, we didn't really officially end slavery. We ended the official institution, but we transformed it into all different kinds of slaveries by another names. From sharecropping to debt peonage to convict leasing to mass incarceration to all these different forms. So a lot of times we never really dealt with a lot of these legacies. And additionally, like in Africa and in many Asian countries, when they gained their independence, Britain, in many ways, a lot of Britain and France and a lot of these European countries, it helped facilitate the independence in many ways. A lot of these transitions were peaceful, but but that was very intentional because they left, the European governments left, installed and left in place these very weak, and very divisive colonial, governments who basically, took over after they left, and which, one, allowed Europe to continue to control these countries through different forms of neocolonialism, and two, also caused a lot of conflicts, caused a lot of revolts and civil wars and power vacuums, which Europe and eventually U.S. didn't stay on the sidelines, but also supported some of the really repressive regimes to help them get into power, because that continued the domination of these countries through neocolonialism. So in many ways, even though colonialism kind of died off, the institutions are still here. And also different new colonial processes are still here. So we're still seeing the legacies today. And so just kind of talking about some of these legacies. For one, I mean, European colonialism created the modern Western world that we talk about when we talk about the global North, when we talk about, the first world, or all these, developed countries, all these, fancy words. We're basically talking about this modern Western world that was developed through colonialism, and more importantly through institutions of slavery and through it's just the genocide of indigenous populations, the stealing the land, the exploitation of these colonies, ultimately just to produce an enormous amount of wealth. And with that wealth, they created modern Europe was built. Industrial revolutions. I mean, like we said, majority of the raw products that fueled industrial revolutions were picked by enslaved hands or by colonized hands that were just as enslaved. This rise of capitalism, is one of the dominant forms of government, of economics, throughout the world, and that could not happen without this colonialism, without it being exported and being used to dominate and exploit the majority of the world, and accrue an enormous amount of wealth. And yet you can say, much of the wealth, and it's hard to really define, the direct links, but indirectly, looking at, just, even though people have made a lot of wealth outside of colonialism today, a lot of those opportunities to even make that wealth, a lot of opportunities of where you stand came from these institutions of colonialism, this white supremacy, of capitalism, of class divisions, of patriarchal divisions, all this stuff, allowed for a lot of people, even that a lot of people think that they're completely removed from colonialism, but they're still in these living in these situations, in these worlds that are dictated by policies that benefit them still to this day. So the vast a lot of wealth, not just the wealth accrued during colonialism, but even the wealth that's continuing to be accrued to unequal exchanges through neocolonialism, through just having having governments having the opportunity to accrue this wealth in the first place, which came through the direct colonialism. So vast majority of the wealth of modern Western world can be directly or indirectly contributed to colonialism. And on the other end, the vast majority of the world's poverty can be when we look at these maps again, just the majority of poverty in this world is found in the governments that were colonized. And that is a direct link. I mean, again, you could say, well, we're so far removed from this now. It's but it's really hard not to have either a direct or indirect link to all these colonialism, even for decisions today. Where they're at, these countries are at today, with the debt they're dealing with, the underdevelopment that they're dealing with, the conflicts that they're dealing with, that was intentionally created as a divide and conquer strategies from European countries. All of this, it's just hard to really remove things, anything directly or indirectly linked to colonialism, to the last 600 years, the exploitation of the land, resources, and people. And we're talking about, hundreds of millions of people who died through diseases, through famines that were caused by Europe countries, through slavery, and you can't fathom what this world would be like with the ways that never happened. And at the same time, we have enormous amount of ethnic tensions and conflicts. A lot of these conflicts that we're seeing today, these ethnic conflicts, a lot of them were directly either created or perpetuated through colonialism. Whether a lot of African countries, the Tutsis and the Hutus, and these were just these are divisions that were created to divide and conquer during African colonizations, and we're still seeing horrific after effects of these ethnic divisions, or even like Palestine and Israel and different countries like that, how these countries were set up and the division, a lot of that came through colonialism. That they were colonized. They were in a sense kind of Europe inherited from Turkey after World War I, but they were essentially just extensions of different forms of colonies that a lot, you can. There's other factors as well, but European colonialism definitely affected a lot of these, and in the way these countries were situated before that their conflicts really blew up. Also, we have colonial institutions of systemic racism that were never dismantled. So one of the main justifications for this brutality that was spread all over the world was the creation of racism, the creation of black and later white, and this division of well, how can we create these democratic countries but still enslave people? Let's create these assumptions and stereotypes and racist sciences and philosophies around the idea that these people were inferior and they were different species. So it was okay to enslave them and kill them because we were bringing civilization to them. So these also these racist systems that did these justifications never went away. And this is what we're dealing with, a lot of systemic racism that we're dealing with that's marginalizing and hurting millions of people. And this is primarily, we see this as political, economic, social, and cultural systems that are dominated by white supremacy. And that, can look like a lot of anti-Blackness, anti-Indigenous culture. It can look like, racial wealth gaps, the Black criminality, criminal justice systems based on, racist stereotypes and internalizations, segregation, housing. I mean, all this stuff came from this, like, anti-Black and anti-Indigenous culture that was used to justify colonialism, and we've never really dealt with these systems and these ideologies and internalizations. And this includes, this idea of like white superiority and Black inferiority. Colonialism, is a big part of, what we see not only in white societies but also in non-white societies as well. India has this, $1 billion industry around, skin whitening cream. Because and that's a direct legacy of Britain treating lighter skinned Indians better, and then discriminating and oppressing darker skinned Indians, and that's a direct legacy of that, and enforcing this like white beauty standards on all other colonies. And then we still have neocolonialism, neoliberalism, disaster capitalism. So all these, we're gonna have a whole class on all these things, but all these different new systems that are used to continue this unequal exchange, continue this domination of by rich countries on poor countries. And then big, legacy is how many capitalistic societies we have, how many societies that are based on exploiting, making wealth through exploiting land and labor. And we see this by this ever-growing wealth gap of like the rich is just, especially in the last like 50 years, the rich have just been getting so much richer. Even during this pandemic, the rich are making an enormous amount of money while poor people are losing an enormous amount of money, and middle class are losing. And we see this as a privatization of just public health. And we see, privatization of healthcare. We're certainly seeing a big takeover of private schools, charter schools, and public housing that's being taken over by private companies. So we see this privatization of these things that are supposed to be commons for us, are supposed to be common resources, but instead are being put on the market and dictated by market, standards. We also continue to see the institutionalization of patriarchy and the devaluation of women's labor. So we talked about that earlier in a section, that even today, majority of the work done by women in this world, entire world, is unpaid, invisible labor. And even, in countries that have gone through a lot of reforms, patriarchal reforms, there's still, even like countries like the United States that have had some success, we still look at this enormous devaluation of women across the board, where men and women working the same jobs, men will make much more money for doing the same work and on the same standards. And that's across the board. That's not just a handful of sexist people. That's institutionalized. That's been institutionalized since the rise of capitalism, and that's across the entire country that we see this occurring. And then the last thing, we're literally killing our planet to the point of no return. Like we have about a decade left to reverse what we're doing, and it doesn't look like we're going to be doing that. So we're literally killing our planet for profit, and we can't stop because these systems of capitalism and its competition, to the point where we talked a little bit about that video about the commons, the tragedy, the tragedy of the commons, and Mexi's talked about how literally if certain companies wanted to stop destroying the planet, they couldn't, because they would lose their competitive edge, and they would probably go out of business. So we've literally created a system where people have to, can't stop destroying the planet out of fear that they may actually become less competitive and actually lose their livelihoods. And the last thing I want to talk about is historical trauma. So we're talking millions and millions of people throughout the world are still experiencing this historical trauma from just this it's a horrific things that happened to so many people through slavery, through indigenous genocide. And then that trauma is captured in our genes, and then we're basically passing down this post-traumatic stress syndrome to our children based on this. And so we can see that directly with like the health effects and wear and tear on the body and the mind, from a lot of people that are still dealing with, still dealing with a world that's still a settler colonial world. Um, And the last thing I want to talk about the legacy, because we're going to talk a lot about, basically this whole course is about the legacy of capitalism. So we're going to talk a lot more about that. So this is a short section because we're going to basically talk, like I said, every class is going to kind of be touching on the legacy of colonialism. But I want to talk about the environmental crisis. So we have this enormous environmental crisis right now. Like I said, we have, a lot of, leading environmental scientists are talking about how we have, maybe a decade left to reverse, the emissions. And I think there's been a lot of research lately to connecting, this environmental crisis to colonialism. I want to read a couple of these quotes because they're short, but they're really good. So this one's actually Greta Thunberg, a new, young environmental activist. I'm sorry, I can't remember the country she's from. It's somewhere in Europe, but she writes that the climate crisis is not just about the environment. It is a crisis of human rights, of justice, and of political will. Colonial, racist, and patriarchal systems of oppression have created and fueled it. We need to dismantle them all. Our political leaders can no longer shirk their responsibilities. And that really talks about plantational, I have a hard time saying this word, plantationalism or Anthropocene, so these are concepts of how just recently, there's these studies of just, studying how just recently with the human expansion and human industrialization and just and how that is actually killing our planet. It's not some natural cycle. So plantational scenes, it describes the devastating transformation of different types of pasturage cultures and forests into closed extracted plantations, which are founded on the work of enslaved people and other forms of work that involve exploitation, alienation, and generally spatial displacement. It reminds us that this model of establishing plantations on a large scale preceded industrial capitalism and allowed it to develop, accumulating wealth on the back of human beings reduced to slavery. From the 15th to 19th century, sugarcane plantations in Brazil, then in Caribbean, were closely linked to the development of mercantilism and colonialism. So it talks about how that colonialism creating, expanding, which basically exported these capitalistic systems that created plantation economy. And they took these sustainable systems of forests and cultures and commons, and they basically privatized it all and created it into these plantation extraction economies. This is what's leading to the demise of our planet right now. This is what's causing the majority of our pollution. We'll read this last quote. In France, researchers are seeking to show how the slave trade, slavery, and conquest and exploitation of colonies allowed capitalism to become structured around an economy of extraction. This destructive way of inhabiting our planet is responsible for ushering in a new geological epoch characterized by human industrial activity, the Anthropocene. The populations of less economically developed countries are not responsible, but they are the ones who suffer. Most of the poor countries on Earth are considerably poorer than they would have been without global warming. At the same time, most of the rich countries are richer than they would have been. And this really, there's been a lot of studies show, because a lot of times we blame, again with this, population, explosion or boom, and it's like white supremacist ideas that our planet's dying because of all these poor, people that can't stop breeding. When in reality, when we look at, like this is a great chart. It shows that CO2 emissions embedded in global trade. So it shows like who has the biggest carbon footprint when it comes to trade, international trade, and you can see Europe and U.S., Japan, Alaska. I mean, these countries have the biggest impact. As opposed to these other, poor countries that they're actually, because they're in reality, I mean, they're extract economies. Most of the industrialization is in these, richer countries, and that's where that enormous amount of pollution, enormous amount of, CO2, footprints is happening. So in reality, I mean, a lot, this isn't these aren't poor people that in poor, less developed countries that are causing this environmental crisis. This environmental crisis is being caused by Western countries, the countries that benefited most from colonialism. All right, so the last section. So I want to talk. We're going to talk about decolonizing. So this is the kind of we've been talking a lot about this. This is a super important concept that we're going to be talking about in most of our classes. This is the idea of recognizing all the things that colonization has created in our societies, and then learning different ways to decolonize it, to kind of dismantle it, whether they're actual physical systems, like our criminal justice system, is based on a lot of colonial, racisms and colonial, based on a lot of colonial stereotypes and racisms. Or it can be as simple as just understanding our real history, understanding indigenous culture and history, and who actually was in this land before us, and what and understanding how that's affected today, and how we're taught about that, and how our society chooses to teach about this in very intentional ways. So it's a kind of understanding all of it. So it's kind of a two, one of it's just kind of dismantling these narratives and these false, educations, and trying, and two is also dismantling these systems that have been built on these and left over from colonialism. So a lot of this started, with the idea of post-colonial theories. So the post-colonialism is something that started mainly in the 60s, after many of these, many of these colonized governments, countries were actually gaining independence, particularly in Africa. There was a whole movement in the 60s, to kind of dismantle, to gain independence and decolonize actual colonial structures. So the legacy, so this post-colonial thought, or post-colonial theory, or post-colonialism, this is mainly just about understanding, be critical, understanding the impacts of colonialism, kind of removing these like BS narratives that, this was the necessary evil for, it was good for everyone, it brought civilization, all these things, removing all these narratives and actually understanding the real consequences of what it meant to control and exploit and colonize people for centuries. And that's important because we don't, before this, these post-colonial theories, I mean, we basically taught, our schools, or and most schools and colonial empires, or colonizer countries, are taught, this very whitewashed Eurocentric history that, that ultimately, we spread, civilization was built, through colonialism. Reality, that was completely the opposite. So it seeks to understand the effects of centuries of colonial rule and exploitation have had on colonial subjects, and not just to understand it, but also to combat the harmful consequences and legacies of colonial oppressions, and also understand personal internalizations and inequalities and systems of racism that were created and left over by colonialism. So, a big start of this post-colonial theory was there was a lot of these really amazing authors in the mid 20th century that started writing about real stories of what it meant to be living under colonization. Things Fall Apart, Midnight's Children, 100 Years of Solitude, Wretched of the Earth. These are really fantastic books. If you ever have a chance to read some of these books, I definitely recommend it. So from that, decolonization kind of rose, from this, post-colonialism is more about, understanding the harmful effects and the consequences of colonization. And then the next step is how do we dismantle this? How do we, free ourselves from these internalizations, from these, bad histories and narratives, and from these, systems that we live in. So decolonization, I'll read a couple definitions. One is a means by which colonial powers, both structural and cultural, are dismantled while supporting self-determination, or the act of freeing, creating your own future. Decolonization refers to the process of deconstructing colonial ideologies of the superiority and privilege of Western thought approaches. On one hand, decolonization involves dismantling structures that perpetuate the status quo, problematizing dominant discourses, and addressing unbalanced power dynamics. On the other hand, decolonization involves valuing and revitalizing indigenous knowledge and approaches, and weeding out settler bias or assumptions that have impacted indigenous ways of being. So decolonization means a total paradigm shift throughout our political, social, culture, and quite importantly, our educational norms. And Google Wikipedia, straightforward, the undoing of colonization. So the undoing of not just political, but also cultural, social, historic, colonization. And then on the other end, there's indigenization, which is one form of colonization. So this is the act of making something more native, the transformation of some services to suit local cultures, especially through the use of more indigenous people in administration, employment, and education. So a lot of this is just about giving indigenous people and indigenous cultures, and also Latin cultures and African cultures, and it's about giving these populations more autonomy, having more control over the systems that are in, especially around education and healthcare. It's now it's not about dismantling everything, but it's about making them more accessible. Healthcare is focused on predominantly on Western European practices and ideologies. So one way of indigenization is kind of incorporating what we have in our healthcare systems, but adding more indigenous knowledge and culture. More practices outside of Western, Western, philosophies, and also, just giving indigenous people more control over what the type of healthcare that they want, or how they want, how that they want to interact with healthcare, instead of forcing them into this kind of white European system. So that's one form of decolonization that we'll see come up quite often. So I want to play, we played a short clip by Nikki Sanchez earlier about, talking about the history of Canadian Indigenous, history. And so this is actually the same video. I just kind of spliced it in half, and I wanted to show one, the history of that, and then now she talks about decolonization. And I want to talk, so I want to play this clip for you.
And I really want to dispel this myth today that decolonization is the work of Indigenous people. Whether you have ancestors that were colonizers or colonized, we are all colonized people. And so this work of decolonization is really work that we need to come together to do with one another, equally accepting our roles, our locations, our privileges, in ways in which we can start to move towards a future that looks like healing, that looks like justice, that looks like dismantling systems of oppression. I work with a lot of settler people who really want to do something about this, but they don't know where to begin. And they feel paralyzed with guilt and shame about this truly ugly history that we've all found ourselves in. And so if I could just leave you with one message today, it would be this. This history is not your fault, but it absolutely is your responsibility. What happened, what has been done is not your fault, but where we find ourselves here together, whether we're Indigenous people, whether we're settler people, whether we're somewhere in between, this is work that we need to pick up. We need to have the courage to look at our past. We need to have the courage to look at where we are now, and we need to work together to figure out how we can collectively heal moving forward. I think it's really important to make the distinction between indigenization and decolonization. As Nigel mentioned, I had the incredible privilege of working on the Viceland documentary series Rise. And in that role, I got to work with Indigenous communities in every continent of the world. And I want to give a shout out to all the Indigenous people on Earth, because the work of indigenization, the work of linguistic revitalization, the work of ceremony, the work of land-based practice, the work of land-based defense, Indigenous people are holding it down. And that is work for Indigenous people to do. That is not work for anyone else to pick up and start to appropriate and call their own. However, decolonization is work that belongs to all of us. Decolonization. We are never going to go back and erase the past. It has already been done. But what we can do is we can start to put spokes and wheels of oppression, of movements that create our social systems of inherent inequity. And to be totally honest, if you wanted to just be motivated to do this for selfish reasons, that would be good enough. We're looking at a state of global climate catastrophe. We're looking at mass migrations because people can no longer inhabit their homelands. And these are all ramifications of a colonial and capitalist worldview that eradicated a balance, a sense of reciprocity, a sense of spiritual connection to our homelands. And so if we continue forward without acknowledging the Indigenous people on whose lands and territories we live, we're headed for certain disaster. Whether we like it or not, colonization is a messy and shameful history that connects us all. Here we are all in this room together. So what do we do moving forward? When people ask me, what can I do to decolonize? I give them a caveat and I tell them, well, that's not going to be a one answer. It's not going to be a one-day fix. However, I can give you a few first steps, because if you do your work, then we can come back together and collectively do the real work that needs to be done. So if you want to go home today and start to enact your journey of decolonization, you can figure out how to answer that first question I said to you. Where do your people come from? How did you get here? Learn whose land you live on and what has been done to them in order for you to occupy their lands. Address the oppressive systems and history that enable you to occupy the territory you do now. Find out how you benefit from this history and activate one strategy wherein you can use your privilege to dismantle that. And share this knowledge, share this conversation with your barista, with your babysitter, with your Tinder date. I don't care. But I want you to have these conversations. And I promise you, when you start to have these conversations of looking at a longer now, of asking the history of people, your world will suddenly become a lot more interesting. And so will your identity. Finally, what's it all for? Why should we do this? Well, because decolonization looks like living without paralyzing guilt and shame about who you are and the social identity you've inherited. Decolonization looks like giving up social and economic power and privilege that directly disempowers, appropriates, and invisibilizes others. Decolonization looks like smashing the patriarchy. Decolonization looks like doing the work to find out who you are, where you came from, and committing to build communities that work together to collectively create a more sustainable and equitable future. And finally, decolonization looks like celebrating who we are and connecting with the unique knowledge that we each bring to this time and that we need to solve the problems that are laid out in front of us. So it's really easy to think about our future ancestors because we have such beautiful little ones in the room. Good reminder. Thank you so much for opening this space today. But I really invite you to look back and think about your grandmothers that I asked you about, and take a moment to look forward and ask yourself what you can do in your lifetime, what you can do today and in your work and with your passions and with your gifts to start to dismantle a history that none of us should be proud of, so that maybe we can offer an inheritance for our future ancestors for not only a planet that's livable, but a social system and community that's equitable and just. Last Kamadi. Thank you so much.
Okay. So I made a list of different things that, because decolonization, it can sometimes feel overwhelming. Like, how do we, start this? Nikki Sanchez talked about, just feeling paralysis. So I made a list of things that we could start working towards, and some of these things are easier than others for sure. But I won't read this before I read the first one. I read this quote: "Erasing or ignoring history is one of the main tools of colonization that helps the colonizer to ideal their own history and support the idea that their values are better and greater than those who they colonize. That's why they don't teach us our history in schools," and that's so important. Like, I mean, in order to dismantle a lot of these bigger systems, we're going to need to get the majority of our population to actually understand our real history. We desperately need to stop teaching, Eurocentric, U.S. exceptionalism, whitewashed history to our children. I used to be a high school teacher, a history teacher, and like 90% of what we teach is bad. you cannot understand the history, you cannot understand what where we need to go, what we need to do with the history that we're teaching, and that's how a lot of people, it makes it a lot more easier to join other really horrific causes when you don't have the proper education and understanding of what's happening. So we need to teach our history. We need to teach both our perspectives, good and bad. We need to teach all the cultures. We need to teach our history through multiple perspectives. We need to teach history through a Native perspective, through a Black perspective, through a Latinx perspective. We need to confront false colonial narratives, these ideas of manifest destiny that or that necessary evils, or that we spread civilization. I mean, we destroyed civilization when we created the Western world, and we need to teach that. We need to understand there were civilizations, beautiful civilizations before us, and then we need to talk about how we get back to that. We need to understand past and present colonialism and capitalism. We have this obsession with capitalism. We are a capitalistic society, and everyone's pushes these narratives where if we're not capitalistic, then we're going to be, like the Soviet Union or like some, authoritarian country if we're not capitalistic. And that's completely wrong. And that's actually, colonial narratives that's being pushed. There are better ways beyond capitalism, and we don't have to dismantle completely. We can push through, mixed economies, but we need to confront our inability to realize what capitalism is doing right now. And we need to have more truth and reconciliation commissions. Again, that's not perfect. I know Canada is still struggling with the next steps, but just the fact that they did a truth and reconciliation commission, it's huge. It just acknowledges, the actual history, acknowledges what's going on. I mean, that's the first step, to actually creating the policies to fix the damage. It's not definitely not the only step, but it's a great first step. We need to dismantle these structures that perpetuate these status quo, these colonial structures, whether it's the police, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, whether it's capitalism, patriarchy, voter suppression. We need to find better ways to do all these things. We need economic injustice. We need reparations. Hands down, if you understand our history, then you can understand how insane it is that we've never done reparations. We need reparations. We need defund police campaigns that move, policing funds to actual, community health funds. We need affirmative action. We need policies of closing, racial wealth gaps and gender wealth gaps and class wealth gaps as well. We need to be supporting, self-determination and sovereignty of communities of color, of tribal communities. We need to increase their representation. We need to increase their autonomy. We need to get the federal government out of their lives. Especially around reservations we need to give them autonomy. They need to deal with a lot of their issues, especially like missing and murdered Indigenous women. Like tribal, a lot of tribal governments and tribal polices can't prosecute non-native abusers, and that's what's leaving these huge holes. So we need to kind of fix it. We need these fixes, these jurisdictional nightmares. Valuing and revitalizing Indigenous and African knowledge and cultures. We need to increase fair representation and stop, supporting, this white, standard for media, for beauty, and we need to support, fair representation. We need to, confront, unfair. We need to confront, these racist stereotypes and that permeate, our media, our social media, our culture, our sports teams, that all needs to go. We need to have fair representation of Black people and Indigenous people, not only in our media but also in our institutions. When we make decisions about healthcare, about education, about policing, Black Indigenous people need to make these decisions, for their communities, not white people. We need to create spaces that are more inclusive and respectful and honor Indigenous peoples and African Americans. This is not only just creating inclusive spaces, asking the question when you create these spaces and only white people show up, instead of just being like, oh, they don't care, ask, really have, self-reflecting on what you're doing to create exclusive, spaces. And things like native land acknowledgements, we need to, start incorporating native land acknowledgements. We need to protect Black-only spaces, spaces that Black people and Indigenous people can actually heal without having to deal with, white supremacy. And it's just exploring, our internalizations. We need to, all of us need to start working on internalizations, whether that's Black inferiority, white superiority, or the Black criminality, the uncivilized Native, inferior Black, Indigenous people of color, white supremacy, racial hierarchies. All of these things, we didn't. These are unconscious things that we were all born into these societies, and we absorb these things based on what was being permeated in our culture and in our societies. And we all need to do our part to kind of, confront our own internalizations. So that's a lot. I mean, but that's, again, a lot of this is just finding organizations that are doing this work already and kind of finding ways to support them and to learn from them as well. And a big part of this is really understanding, anti-Black and anti-Indigenous policies and cultures, these colonial institutions that are left over, particularly like colonialism, but a lot of different things, other structures and systems. So, it's important that we all understand, like, anti-Blackness. So anti-Blackness, I like this quote to find this. Anti-Blackness is the inability to recognize Black humanity. So in order to actually enslave millions of African people, we had to create racism. We had to create this idea that all Black people were one species and they're inferior, and then we had to basically dehumanize them. We had to, do a dignification of Black people, and that has never, that lasted for centuries, and that has never really gone away. It's actually, stayed in our culture, stayed in our criminal justice systems, and this idea that Black people are devoid of, we automatically dehumanize Black people, through policies, through policing policies, through, our internalizations of the fears of Black criminality or fears of Black, people taking advantage of systems, welfare systems and all that stuff. And a lot of, and so a lot of this is just kind of doing our own work, our internalization works, of understanding what, we all have anti-Black internalization. So we need to kind of explore that. And do our personal confrontations, but at the same time, we also need to support Black culture, support Black businesses, support, Black Lives Matters and civil rights movements and things like that, and confront these white, supremacy institutions that challenge that, whether it's Our Lives Matter, or defunding, or people opposing defunding police campaigns, or things like that. We have to be on the side of Black humanity is basically where we need to get at. In colorism, we need to understand colorism as well. So colorism is straight from a colonial system of valuing the more white you are, while discriminating and oppressing the more Black you are. And that's straight up, we see this all throughout, colonialism, whether it's like Spanish had their own caste systems where based on purity of blood, and the more European or white you were, the more privileges you had. United States, continued with that, based on creating the concept of whiteness in the 1700s, and then creating all kinds of privileges for white people, and discrimination for Black people. But you see this so much that it permeates, and it actually is not just something that you find with white people. This actually is something that's all people have internalized. Like we talked about this a little bit already, but this is just such a great example that the skin lightening industry is literally worth billions of dollars. It's particularly in India, but all over the world. People are selling, making an enormous amount of money, selling, these unsafe products that oftentimes cause really bad, health effects on people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, all to kind of light their skin. This is an actual ad for one of these, skin products. Look how unhappy they are until, they're white, and suddenly they're happy. So this upholds this white supremacy that, white is normal, good, and beautiful is the standard, and Black is abnormal, bad, and ugly. So we have to, challenge these industries. And in our internalizations. This isn't just a white person thing. This is like all of us have internalized these colonial cultural systems. And we played this video in the third class, the bias class. So I apologize if you've seen this already, but if not, I think it's just important to kind of hear about some personal, testimonies about how colonialism has affected people throughout the world.
It's something that I don't usually talk about because I'm afraid that I'm making people uncomfortable. It's something that affects me in almost every aspect of life. There's something about having dark skin on a woman's body that shapes the way she moves through the world. There's something about having darker skin on a male body that shapes the way in which he moves through the world. It has real life stakes.
From what I've seen growing up, dark skin equates to being poor, dirty, ratchet.
They tend to be the bad guys in Tyler Perry movies, straight from the border.
That doesn't even make any sense. I'm not deemed as beautiful, therefore I am not beautiful. And those two are not really mutually exclusive. Could it be that something as early as colonization or slavery is primarily responsible for our beauty standards today? We're talking about who works in the field and who works in the house. We're also talking about rape, the rape of slaves to produce people who are known as mulattoes or mixed race. These standards of beauty travel. Eurocentric standards of beauty travel.
In the Dominican society and our culture, they have a phrase that's like mejorando la raza, advancing the Dominican population and making sure we're going into how they say the better. If you're lighter, you're bettering the race and you're bettering the island versus if you're just being you.
I would get called the blackness. One joke that really stuck with me was like, oh, Edgar's so black that when he leaves a car, the check engine light turns on. That was a reference to my skin being as dark as oil. I felt ugly being of a darker skin tone. So I tried to gel my hair, or I started listening to skater punk music. So I tried culturally to lighten myself, if that makes sense.
I went on a trip to Korea with my mom. Some woman walked up to my mom and she asked, "Why is your daughter so dark?" In Korea, you have to be pale, and I almost felt like a foreigner and not so much Korean anymore. When we turn off the lights, they say, "Oh, Salorm, where did you go?" Or, "Oh, you're really pretty for a dark-skinned girl." Are you saying that my race and just the fact that I am black, is that not attractive in general?
I remembered one time that I wanted to be an angel in a parade. At that time, they were like kind of racist, they didn't like black people to be angels. And my mommy got kind of freaked out. She was going like, "Please don't, you cannot be an angel because they're gonna laugh at you." I said, "But mommy, I am an angel." And finally, I was an angel. And I was the only black angel walking in the street. And my mommy was so proud about it, and I was proud too.
My mom started buying me a cream called Fair and Lovely. I was in 3rd grade when I started using bleaching creams. And the whole general idea was, if I'm lighter, I'll have a better life. I'll find somebody that's gonna love me. There would still be light and dark patches on my body and my face. It's painful, it would hurt, and I started breaking out in like bad rashes, and no one said anything. I had to stop it myself.
How do we fix this? We think critically about colorism. We think about where it began and where it begins and ends with us. I think change starts with providing more diversity. Providing more examples of people that look like you.
If you look at telenovelas, they usually cast the dark-skinned person as the villain. And if you never met a Latino before, you're gonna somewhat think that.
So in Japanese media, I honestly don't think I've ever seen a darker-skinned female. I feel it would be nice to see a change.
It needs to start within our own culture, where we can't have Will Smith filling in every slot for black people. Giving dark-skinned people roles that are not only supporting roles, but leading roles.
All right, so cut off there, but definitely worth, you're listening to the whole video. It's a really powerful, video about the direct impacts, the individual impacts of colorism. So also, it's important to understand the anti-Indigenous racism that we have. And we had a slide earlier about mascots and talked about just how normalized anti-Indigenous racism is, to the point that there is super racist, indigenous racist things that we just accept, and we'll even argue that it's not racist anymore, like the Washington Redskins or things like that. But anti-Indigenous racism is a form of structural racism embedded with institutions which is causing harm to Indigenous people. So a lot of this is kind of we talked about already, but a lot of this is, for example, it's like the erasure of Indigenous history and culture, whitewash Eurocentric history, the lack of land acknowledgements and things like that, lack of self-determination, lack of reparations, reconciliation, return of land. I mean, there's so much unceded land that we took from natives, and they never officially ceded, or if they did, it was forced by gunpoint and on treaties that the U.S. broke themselves. So there's a lot of land that needs to be given back to Indigenous people. Lack of safety from missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is it's clearly this is a problem that is directly coming from anti-Indigenous racism through this to the point that Indigenous people are so dehumanized that even when they're missing and murdered by the thousands, we still lack any kind of official response. So policing, social workers taking Native children, police brutality, racism in media and cultural appropriation, the horrific way that we portray Indigenous culture in our media. Environmental racism, building pipelines through native lands, selling their land to mining companies and things like that, and to waste companies, and then just the lack of culture and institutions, so the lack of any kind of Indigenous culture in our schools and our education and our healthcare and our criminal justice system, any kind of like culture where they can actually be a part of these systems, and it's not just some Eurocentric system that we're forcing onto them. So I like this quote: "The dialogue around anti-Indigenous racism must highlight the reality that Indigenous peoples are often excluded from policy decision-making tables with organizations and institutions. If we are included, it is common that we are dismissed or tokenized as at these tables, wherein our sharing of knowledge and lived experiences are not taken seriously, thus not incorporated into final reports or policy documents." Then understanding settler privilege. So Nikki Sanchez talked about this, like the regardless of what when you came to these countries, these post-colonial countries, regardless where you are at, if involvement with Indigenous, you're still a part of this settler colonialism. This isn't a historical thing. I mean, we are living settler colonialism right now, where we are dominating. We're living off of stolen land while the original inhabitants are struggling. So whether one participates in settler colonialism is not entirely a matter of when or how one's ancestors came to the U.S. Having settler privilege means that some combination of one's economic security, U.S. citizenship, sense of relationship to the land, mental and physical health, cultural integrity, family values, career aspirations, and spiritual lives are not possible without the territorial disposition of Indigenous peoples. So it's just about understanding that all of this, that we have, would not be possible if we hadn't, killed and displaced, millions of Indigenous people. So this leads to like bad Indigenous allyship approaches, and this is important to kind of understand as well. We have a couple really bad ones like that we see a lot. One of this is this romantic approach where we romanticize, Indigenous cultures, as being this, this perfect way, thing, and we hold up and value their culture while still supporting systems that are dispossess them and discriminate and harm them. So it's like this thing of idealizing them while still participating and being complicit with their oppression. And then also this could be tough because a lot of ways, a lot of tribal very poor tribal governments are trying to survive is through doing things that may not necessarily be the most environmental things that they're looking at. Some of them are looking at coal industries and things like that as a means of survival, and so they get a lot of flack from us because we're suddenly like the judges of whether they're being good indigenous people or not. So just kind of removing this, like not idealizing them, just dealing, but looking at them as just real people that are suffering from these infrastructures and policies that we are complicit with. And the same boat approach is this idea that indigenous cultures and non-indigenous environmentalists are in the same boat and they're trying to fight for the same things. But in reality, a lot of it, we talked about, a lot of environmental efforts that actually really hurt indigenous cultures, from the formation of parks to, creating, certain acts like the 1970s Clean Water and Safe Drinking Act had no mention of American Indian tribal lands and laws. So it's a lot of this stuff, it's not the same boat. There may be some overlapping issues, like the Dakota Access Pipeline. There was a lot of environmentalists enjoying that. And they can share that similar cause of this, of like fighting fossil fuels and things like that. But there's a bigger thing happening, a settler colonialism, the fact that these indigenous people don't have a say in their lives anymore, their land anymore, and that goes beyond this environmentalist. So we have to stop thinking that this is just like we're all in the same boat. And understand the differences and the realities that indigenous people or dealing with. And then we have the Yosemite model, which we talked a little bit about. It's just again, the idea that these conservation efforts oftentimes actually hurt native cultures. So we had a lot of past parks displaced thousands of native people in the name of conservation, when in fact we displaced the people that were actually doing a great job conserving them, and then replaced them by this white culture that has not done a great job. And we still see this today happening all over the world. So read this: national parks, ecological restoration projects, conservation zones, and even the uses of certain terms, especially wilderness, are associated with forced displacement of entire communities, erasure of indigenous histories and education and public memory, and economic marginalizations and violations of cultural and political rights. So a big part of this is like decolonizing our approach to allyship. So there's a couple good quotes on this. I like this one by Zoe Todd. Ecological footprint of colonialism is systematic. Sorry. The ongoing U.S. colonial legacy includes forcing indigenous peoples into grid-like reservation that empower corporations and private individuals to degrade our territories, fostering patriarchal conditions for sexual violence in indigenous communities, brainwashing indigenous children through boarding schools, and brainwashing everyone else through erasing indigenous histories and experiences across U.S. culture and education and memory. So allyships, recognizes all these things, recognize that it's not just about environment, or protections, but it's actually about dismantling a lot of these bigger systems that cause a lot of harm. It's about challenging settler privileges and different ecological systems. It's about, it's a big thing about like stop trying to avoid future eco disasters and realize that natives are actually living that right now. So it's another great quote around that. One can't claim to be an ally if one's agenda is to prevent his or her own future dystopias through actions that also preserves today indigenous dystopias. This is why so many of our environmental movements are all about stopping sexual and state violence against indigenous people, reclaiming ethical self-determination across diverse urban and rural ecosystems, empowering gender justice and gender fluidity, transforming lawmaking to be consensual, healing intergenerational traumas, and calling out practices that erase indigenous histories and cultures and experiences. So it's not just about, preventing, the climate change, being an ally by, helping out with, pipelines and things. It's more about understanding the true realities that are happening in indigenous cultures and going beyond just climate change, and also understanding about, how can we help, bring self-determination, how can we help, stop sexual and state violence against indigenous people, and help them, how can we help with healing intergenerational traumas and things like that. So that's what really is, about beyond this self, I don't want to say selfish goal, but it's beyond this like personal, individual goal of climate change and moving beyond that to understanding that the realities indigenous people actually are experiencing. So I want to play this video. I'm going to read this quote. It's by Sharina Clanton. Sorry, I can't see the top. But it says, to be an ally, oh man, come on, Zoom. Pop up your menu. Okay, to be an ally is to learn to stand by. I can't read the last top. But then the next part says that Aboriginal people are not here to be your token Indigenous friend or colleague. We are human beings and should not have to justify or plead for our own humanity. We are not here to do emotional labor for you. We are not here to challenge and deconstruct your ignorance, only to have you revert to your privilege and rage with your old fears and prejudice. We do not exist to cater towards your own fragility or microaggressions you uphold to exclude separate Indigenous people or people of color from the mainstream narrative or conversations. To be an ally, you must be willing to listen, truly listen. As an ally, I will challenge everything you think you know about Indigenous people, whether consciously aware of bias or not. You must be willing to be brutally honest about your individual perception and relationship towards Indigenous people. Your awareness is our truth will help to shift the perspective lens and change the landscape. Only through education and awareness will we be able to deconstruct this elitism and power for yourself and within wider community. I'm going to play this video real quick.
When do Indigenous people get a social, cultural, and economic empowerment and voice in Parliament? We're asking to deconstruct the systems that exist. We're asking.
So a big part about decolonization is that it's decolonizing our approach to allyship as well. So we often have this, you know, we talked about this in a little bit on the last slide. We often mix environmental causes with Indigenous causes, and there are a lot of overlaps, but there is also more to this. I think about, you know, sometimes like when the Amazon was burning last year, when there was like fires all over the Amazon, and the majority of that was from, you know, animal agricultural industries. So there's this, you know, a lot of white environmentalists, you know, push this as a call to you know, stop eating, you know, meat, you know, because which, you know, is true. You know, like we desperately as a planet need to stop eating a lot of less meat. It's a horrific colonial system that is based on massive exploitation. But at the same time, I mean, even if, you know, they stopped, you know, all meat production in the Amazon, we still have these colonial, anti-Indigenous, and capitalist systems where we're going to just find another product. We're going to start growing palm oil or something else down there, you know, and to continue this capitalistic, you know, approach to systems that exploit, you know, Indigenous land. So, you know, yes, you know, it's like an and situation. Yes, we need to all stop, you know, eating meat and reduce our meat consumption. And at the same time, we need to understand that, you know, this is not just about, you know, a meat industry. It's also about our capitalism. It's about, you know, post-colonialism. It's about, you know, our domination still to this day of Indigenous people and devaluing and dehumanizing Indigenous people, and then a continuation of making profit off of land. I mean, we continue, you know, they'll keep on making products on Indigenous land as long as we keep on buying those products, you know. So it's about understanding, you know, how we can be a better ally, and it's, you know, it's again, it's the and situation, you know, like stop eating meat, yes, but at the same time, we need to start resisting capitalism and colonialism and start understanding, you know, these systems of oppression. So I really like this quote from Kyle Powell's, I think, White. One can't claim to be an ally if one's agenda is to prevent his or her own future dystopia through actions that also preserve today's Indigenous dystopias. Yet how many environmentalists do just this? I do not see much differentiating those who fight to protect the colonial fantasy of wilderness from those who claim that Dakota Access Pipeline does not cross Indigenous lands. Indigenous environmental movements work to reject ancestral dystopias and colonial fantasies of the present. This is why so many of our environmental movements are about stopping sexual and state violence against Indigenous people, reclaiming ethical self-determination across diverse urban rural ecosystems, and empowering gender justice and gender fluidity, transforming lawmaking to be a consensual healing intergenerational trauma, and calling out all practices that erase Indigenous histories, cultures, and experiences. So, you know, again, it's and situations. Let's stop the pipeline. Let's work on focusing on stopping climate change, and let's also understand that a lot of this environmental damage is actually coming from colonial systems, from capitalistic systems, that are continuing harm directly towards indigenous populations. So let's work on, dismantling all of these systems as well, in the common cause, so. And I want to play this. Her name Sharina Clanton. She's a activist and a leader in Australia. And Aborigine rights leader. She does this really great. She's on this panel during this video talking about how to empower Indigenous rights.
When do Indigenous people get a social, cultural, and economic empowerment and voice in Parliament? We're asking to deconstruct the systems that exist. We're asking to be invited to the table. I don't know how you bridge the gap in terms of Aboriginal people are still struggling to have a voice. We are the sovereign owners of this country. I am a Wongatha Yamaji Noongar Gidja. We have never ceded sovereignty. I am tired of begging and asking for our humanity. When is it enough? We share sovereignty with the Crown. The Queen still owns some of our traditional lands. We're still begging to protect sacred sites that are over 80,000 years old. From mining companies, from gas companies. We want to be the author of our own destinies. We want to be the voice because we are tired of non-Indigenous Australia thinking they know what is good for us and thinking that they can be the voice for Aboriginal Australia. So they should all learn to keep their mouth shut and start engaging Aboriginal Australia into the conversation.
Okay. I think that last line could be applicable anywhere. We don't engage Indigenous populations in their situation that they're dealing with what they're, the policies that are directly affecting them. And that is one of the most important things we can do is stop assuming we know what's best, and stop with this white saviorism, this white supremacy that's got capitalistic intentions behind it as well, and start giving self-determination and sovereignty to these people, and to because they are the ones that know how best to take care of themselves. So we have, this is a slide that appears in multiple different presentations, but it talks about allyship, and it's really, it's not a hard thing, but just understanding allyship. And this goes with, whether you want to support Indigenous, groups, Black Lives Matter, whatever. If you're showing up, you want to be careful that you don't bring this white saviorism. You don't bring this, you don't, co-opt their movement and be the main voice. I really like this from Kyla Reed's, the allies always center the impacted, listen and learn from those who live in oppression, leverage your privilege and yield the floor. So a lot of this is just about, listening can be much more powerful than talking, just listening to what marginalized people are dealing with and their needs, believing marginalized people when they say what their experiences, don't challenge them, don't, cross-examine them, believe them what they're experiencing, don't, research about this content, educate yourself. And we have Google is amazing, platform to find all different kinds of, there's amazing, Black Indigenous people of color written all kinds of amazing articles about, what it means to be Black Indigenous in this country, instead of, relying too much on our friends, do your own research, understand, listen and educate, and make that an ongoing experience. And when confronted, which we do, called out, called in, it's easy to get, take that personal or be reactive, but try to, confront that, have humility and don't take it personal. White people need to have tougher skins. we need to understand that, people confronting us are coming from, tough situations, and they're not always going to, hold our hands, so we need to have tougher skins when confronted. We need to use our privilege to challenge, to educate others about racism and white privilege. I mean, people, your white family is going to, listen to you way more than they're going to listen to some black person that's trying to educate them about what's happening. So you need to do that. We need to speak up. We need to use our places at work, our power, our privilege, and work, and as well to bring these issues in light, to talk about anti-racist policies that you can incorporate in your work, in your church, in your community. And uplift marginalized, don't co-opt, but uplift marginalized voices. So when there's good articles and when there's good speeches and things happening and calls, for needs, repost those, retweet them, highlight them, and help find resources for them. And then it's, support is volunteer with social justice. So, I mean, it could be overwhelming, like all the things, decolonization, all this stuff. But there's organizations that know how to do this, support these organizations, financially, if you can't show up personally, advocate for them, help them, you don't have to be the person that creates the change. You could be the person that helps create the change, help others, organizations create this change. So I'm going to play this. I believe this is one of the last slides. I'm going to play this. There's been a whole movement to kind of decolonize the Brooklyn Museum, and this is not just Brooklyn alone, but a lot of museums. And I kind of want to end this on this type of decolonization, because it directly affects the I mean, there's so much to just these museums. It's not just about, history is important. It's about erasing history, and also co-opting history and pushing colonial narratives, and it's about so much more. So I'm just going to play this video. It does a really great job talking about this movement right now.
You may have heard about the recent controversial hiring of a white woman as the curator of the African art collection at the Brooklyn Museum. Many pointed to the problems of diversity within the museum, but what you probably haven't heard about is the call for the Brooklyn Museum to form a decolonization commission. Remember that museum scene in Black Panther? Killmonger's confronted by a British curator who white-splains the history of an African object that he is looking at. He promptly corrects her by claiming it's actually from the nation of Wakanda, adding,
"How do you think your ancestors got these? You think they paid a fair price? Or did they take it like they took everything else?"
Well, that scene in Black Panther recently hit a lot closer to home since the film came out. In an open letter, we addressed the hire as just a symptom of a larger structural problem and proposed a decolonization commission as an opportunity to the curatorial crisis. The aim of the letter was to redress the ongoing legacies of oppression in which the museum is complicit. The call for decolonization comes from about 20 groups in the city, among which are Decolonize This Place, American Indian Community House, Brooklyn Anti-Gentrification Network, Movement to Protect the People, and NYC Stands with Standing Rock. So what can a decolonization commission look like? We will have to start from the land that the museum sits on, a territorial acknowledgement that the museum is on the territory of the Lenni Lenape. The Brooklyn Museum holds over 6,000 African artifacts, making it the largest collection of African art in the United States. And while historians are often able to date the objects to very specific times and locations, information about how these objects ended up in the museum is often obscure. So we call for an inventory of all colonial era objects of both African and Indigenous people, with the goal of reparations and repatriation. Additionally, we call for an upgrade of working conditions and pay for ground staff, including security, food service, and janitorial divisions, who are largely people of color. The Brooklyn Museum has done some amazing shows like We Wanted a Revolution, Black Radical Women, and the current show, Radical Women, Latin American Art. But at the same time, the museum plays the huge role in the gentrification of the neighborhood. So we ask, does it just want the art and not the people? The Brooklyn Museum is by no means alone. The American Museum of Natural History literally has these skulls of African people in their collection. And the Smithsonian owns the remains of the bodies of massacred indigenous people. Yet rarely are the histories of slavery and genocide acknowledged in these museums. To be clear, this call to action was never an attack or campaign against the newly appointed white curator of African art, Kristen Windmuller Luna. She may very well be a highly qualified candidate, but her hiring highlights several systemic issues latent in the art world itself. Only 4% of art curators, conservators, educators, and senior museum staff in the US are African American. Surrounding these conversations around diversity in the arts is a long-standing call for people of color to be able to control their own narratives. But let's be honest, the idea of repatriation is fundamentally against the interest of museums and their board members. There's a not-so-accidental link between the history of stolen indigenous artifacts and the damage to communities of color through the gentrification practices those same museums and institutions uphold. And that sentiment begs another question. Who are these museums for? Are they for the surrounding communities that their board members, including real estate tycoon David Berliner, are strategically pushing out? Are they even for the people whose cultures have been systemically stolen from them? As Audre Lorde puts it, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. With the call for Decolonization Commission, Decolonize This Place is calling for a radical examination of the foundation and structure of the institution. Radical as in going down to the roots of the United States as a settler colony. The theft of land, labor, and culture over 4 centuries that continues to play out today as gentrification displaces and dispossesses people of color at the doorstep of the museum itself. Will the museum listen to the communities it claims to serve, or will it continue business as usual? Summed up in the banners dropped at last week's action, they want the art, but not the people.
And then, so the last part, we just want to give some decolonizing resources. There's some really great readings. Olivia Balkos put together this Decolonized Environmental Education packet that just, it's a wealth of amazing resources. There's lots of, Shanine Pete, 1,100 different ways to indigenize and decolonize academic programs. And then there's some great organizations to kind of, start, follow, as well as lead other, organizations. So again, you don't need to do all of this on yourself, but just kind of support the organizations that are already working on decolonizing. All right. So for the last slide, I just want to leave with this great poem, which I think is just a great, along the lines of decolonization, along the lines of like learning about what people can steal and what they can't steal. And I think it's an amazing poem to kind of end this section on decolonization. So thank you all so much for participating and following along, and I will see you all next week. Thank you.